All right. The Knight in the Rusty Armor. Are you ready for chapter 2? Let's go. Chapter 2. In Merlin's Woods. It was no easy task finding the wily wizard. There were many forests and only one Merlin. So the poor knight rode on, day after day and night after night, becoming weaker and weaker. Once away from his castle, eating and drinking became more of a problem. Even though Juliet had taken to throwing food at him, she had a high percentage of hits. As for drinking, his vassal had always been more than happy to throw a bucket of water in his face. But out in the woods, he could barely stay alive. All he could find to eat were some occasional berries, which he managed to push through the holes in his visor. And the only way he could get something to drink was to stick his head into a stream, which filled his helmet with water. Twice he almost drowned. After a month of this, the knight was quite depressed. He still hadn't found Merlin, even though he had traveled many leagues. And what depressed him further was that he didn't even know how far a league was. As he rode alone through the woods, the knight came to the conclusion that there were a lot of things he didn't know. He had always thought of himself as a very smart knight. Now, trying to survive in the woods, he didn't feel smart at all. He had to admit he didn't even know which of the berries he had come by were poisonous and which were edible. Every time he ate, it was like playing Russian roulette. And ever since entering the woods, he had been lost. He couldn't tell north from south or east from west. Fortunately, his horse knew the difference. One morning, he woke up feeling weak and a little strange. That was the morning he found Merlin, the wise magician. The knight recognized him at once. Merlin was sitting under a tree, clothed in a long white robe. Animals of the forest were gathered around him, and birds were sitting on his shoulders and arms. The knight shook his head glumly, his armor squeaking. How had all these animals found Merlin so easily when for him it had been so hard? Wearily, he climbed down from the horse. "I've been looking for you," he said. "I've been lost for months." "All your life," corrected Merlin, biting off a piece of carrot and sharing it with the nearest rabbit. The knight stiffened. "I didn't come here to be insulted." "Perhaps you have always thought the truth to be an insult," said Merlin, taking back the carrot from the rabbit and sharing it with the other animals. The knight didn't like this remark either, but he was too weak from hunger and thirst to climb back on his horse and ride away. Instead, with much creaking and clanking, he sat down on the grass. Merlin gave him a kindly look. "You are almost fortunate." "You are most fortunate. You are now too weak to run." "What does that mean?" snapped the knight. Merlin smiled. "A person cannot run and learn. He must stay in one place." The knight relented. "I'm going to stay only long enough to learn how to get out of this armor." "When you learn that," suggested Merlin, "you'll never again have to climb on your horse and ride off in all directions." The knight was too tired to question this, but for the first time in his life, he felt truly comforted and promptly fell asleep. When he awakened, the animals and Merlin were gathered around him. He tried to sit up, but was too weak. Merlin held out a silver cup with some strange colored fluid in it. "Drink this," he ordered. "What is it?" asked the knight, eyeing it suspiciously. "You are so afraid," said Merlin, "but of course, that is why you put on the armor in the first place." The knight didn't bother to deny this, for he was too thirsty. "All right, I'll drink it. Just throw it in my face." "Nothing doing," said Merlin. "It's too precious to waste." He plucked a reed, put one end in the cup, and slipped the other into one of the holes in the knight's visor. "That's a great idea," said the knight. "I call it a straw," replied Merlin. "Why?" "Why not?" The knight nodded and sipped the fluid. The first sips seemed bitter. Then they became more pleasant. The last swallows were quite delicious. Gratefully, the knight handed the cup back to Merlin. "You ought to put that stuff on the market. You could sell flagons of it." Merlin just smiled. "What do you call it?" asked the knight. "Life," Merlin replied. "Life?" "Yes," said the wise man. "Did it not at first seem bitter? Then as you tasted more of it, was it not more pleasant?" The knight nodded with a clank. Yes, and the last swallows were quite delicious. That was when you began to accept what you were drinking. You're saying that life is good when you accept it? Asked the knight. Isn't it? Replied Merlin, raising an eyebrow in amusement. Do you expect me to accept 200 pounds of armor? Ah, said Merlin, you were not born with that. You put it on yourself. Now, can you tell me why? Why not? Said the knight, a bit irritably. His head was beginning to hurt. He was not used to thinking this way. You will be able to think more clearly when you regain your strength, said Merlin. Then he clapped his hands, and the squirrels, holding nuts in their little mouths, encircled the knight. Each squirrel in turn climbed up onto the knight's shoulder, cracking and chewing a nut and pushing the pieces through his visor. The rabbits did the same with the carrots and the deer with roots and berries. This method of feeding would not be endorsed by the health department, but if you're stuck in your armor in the forest, what else can you do? Every day, the animals would feed the knight in this manner, and Merlin would give him large cups of life to drink through a straw. Slowly, the knight began to regain his strength and was filled with new hope. Each day, he would ask Merlin the same question: when will I be able to get this armor off? And each day, Merlin would reply, Patience, you've been wearing it for a long time. You cannot get it off in a short time. One night, as the animals in the night were gathered around Merlin, listening to him play the latest troubadour hits on his lute, the knight decided to question him about something that had long been on his mind. Waiting until Merlin had finished playing Hark Ye the Days of Old, when nights were warm and maidens were cold, he asked the wise man, Were you really the teacher of King Arthur? The magician's face lit up. Yes, I taught Arthur, he said. But how can you still be alive? That was ages ago, exclaimed the knight. The past, present, and future are one when you are connected to the source, replied Merlin. But I don't understand, said the knight. That's because you're trying to understand with your mind. Your mind is limited. But I have a very good mind, said the knight. And a clever one, added Merlin. It trapped you in all that armor. The knight couldn't refute this. Then he remembered something Merlin had said to him when he first arrived. You once said that I put on this armor because I was afraid. Is it not true? Responded Merlin. No, I wore it when I went out to do battle. And was that not because you were afraid you would be killed? Asked Merlin. Well, isn't everybody? Merlin shook his head. Who says you have to go out to do battle? I have to prove that I was a good, kind, and loving knight. If you were really good, kind, and loving, why did you have to prove it? This question gave the knight a headache. He escaped it in his usual manner. He went to sleep. The following morning, he awakened with a strange thought. Could it be that he was not good, kind, and loving? He decided to ask Merlin. What do you think? Inquired Merlin in return. Why do you always answer a question with another question? Demanded the knight. Why not? Replied Merlin. The knight angrily clanked off. One thing he couldn't stand was a smart aleck magician. That Merlin, he muttered. Sometimes he really gets under my armor. So, with much creaking and groaning, the knight sat down under a tree to ponder the magician's words. But his visor kept him from seeing clearly, and he didn't notice that he was sitting next to a squirrel. Could it be, he said aloud, that I'm now good? That I'm not good, kind, and loving? Could be, said the squirrel. Otherwise, why are you sitting on my tail? Huh? The knight strained his head down to one side and saw the little animal. Oh, excuse me, said the knight, quickly moving his leg so the squirrel could remove her tail. I hope I didn't hurt you. I can't see very well. Well, I don't doubt that, replied the squirrel, apparently without resentment. That's why you have to keep apologizing to people for hurting them. The only thing that annoys me more than a smart aleck magician is a smart aleck squirrel, groused the knight. I don't have to stay here and talk to you. Squeaking and clinking, he started to get to his feet, then paused and said in amazement, Hey, you and I are talking. A tribute to my good nature, considering you sat on my tail, replied the squirrel. But animals don't talk. Oh, sure we do, said the squirrel. It's just that people don't listen. The knight shook his head in bewilderment. You've talked to me before? Certainly. Every time I chewed a nut and pushed it through your visor. How come I didn't hear you then? But I do hear you now. How come you always need answers to satisfy your mind instead of just accepting what is? You're answering questions with questions. You've been around Merlin too long. And you haven't been around him long enough. The squirrel flicked her tail at the knight and ran up a tree. The knight called after her, Wait, what's your name? Squirrel, she replied, and vanished into the topmost branches. The knight clanked to his feet and shook his head. Had he imagined all this? At that moment, he saw Merlin approaching. Merlin, he said, I have to get out of here. I've started talking to squirrels. Splendid, replied the magician. The knight looked troubled. What do you mean, splendid? Indeed, you're getting sensitive enough to feel the vibrations of others. The knight was obviously confused, so Merlin continued. You didn't talk to the squirrel in so many words, but you felt her vibrations and translated them into words. I'm looking forward to the day you start talking to flowers. That'll be the day you plant them on my grave, said the knight. I have to get out of this forest. And where would you go? Back to Juliet and Christopher. I miss them and want to go back to them in the worst way. That's exactly how you'll be going back if you go in your armor, continued Merlin. But I really love them, said the knight. Juliet and I used to have terrible fights, but I now see that she gave her very best to me. He looked at Merlin sadly, and I gave her very little in return. I want to go back and make it up to her and be a better father to my son. Merlin nodded in understanding and told the knight that going back to give of himself was a lovely gift. But, he said, a gift, to be a gift, has to be accepted. Otherwise, it lies like a burden between two people. You mean they wouldn't want me back? Asked the knight, looking surprised. Why? I'm one of the top knights in the kingdom. Perhaps that armor is thicker than it appears, Merlin said gently. The knight thought about this and concluded that although Juliet might not want him back, Christopher certainly would. Why don't you send Christopher a note and ask him? Suggested Merlin. The knight agreed that this was a good idea, but how could he get the note to Christopher? Merlin pointed to the pigeon sitting on his shoulder. Rebecca will take it. The knight was puzzled. But she doesn't know where I live. She's only a stupid bird. I know how to get out of this forest, snapped Rebecca, which is more than I can say for you. The knight quickly apologized. He was quite shaken. After all, this was a first, getting both a pigeon and a squirrel mad at him in the same day. But Rebecca, big-hearted bird that she was, accepted the knight's apology and flew off with his hastily written note to Christopher in her beak. Don't coo at any strange pigeons or you'll drop my note, the knight called after her. Rebecca ignored his thoughtless remark, realizing the knight had much to learn. A week passed, and still Rebecca had not returned. The knight became more and more anxious, fearing that she might have fallen prey to one of the hunting falcons that he and the other knights trained. He winced, wondering how he could have participated in such a foul sport. Then he winced again at the awful pun. The knight voiced his fears to Merlin as the magician finished playing his lute and singing, You'll have a long cold winter if you have a short cold heart. Merlin said he was not concerned that the bird would become somebody's dinner. So saying, he made up a happy little verse singing, The smartest pigeon who ever flew will never wind up in someone's stew. Suddenly a great chattering arose from the animals who were all looking skyward. Merlin and the knight looked too. Sure enough, there, circling for a landing, was Rebecca. She landed on Merlin's shoulder. Taking the note from her beak, he glanced at it and gravely told the knight that it was from Christopher. Let me see, said the knight, eagerly seizing the paper. His jaw dropped with a clank as he stared at it in disbelief. It's blank, he exclaimed. What does that mean? It means, said Merlin gently, that your son doesn't know enough about you to give you an answer. The knight stood there stunned. He groaned and slowly creaked to the ground. Finally, he did something he had not done for years. He began to cry. He tried to choke back the tears, for knights in shining armor do not cry. But soon his grief overwhelmed him, and the tears came in torrents. He cried for over an hour. Then, exhausted and half drowned from the tears that still remained in his helmet, he fell asleep. I hope you liked chapter 2. If you want to keep reading, you want to keep listening to the reading, I'll post chapter 3 in the next episode.